Welcome to the Human Odyssey, the podcast about human-centered design. The way humans learn, behave, and perform is a science, and having a better understanding of this can help improve your business, your work, and your life. This program is presented by Sophic Synergistics, the experts in human-centered design. So, let's get started on today's Human Odyssey.
Reginald O'Hara, Director of Applied Health and Performance Research Division at Sophic Synergistics in Houston, Texas. Today I'm with Dr. David Allison, who is the Director of Baylor College of Medicine in the USDA, and I'm very glad to have you here today, Dr. Allison. I know you're a very busy individual in your new role. Can you give the audience a brief background of where you came from in academia, how you started, and what led you into your current position as the director of Baylor College of Medicine?
Certainly. First, let me say, Dr. O'Hara, that it is a pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege and an honor. I appreciate the invitation. So I'm somebody who has sort of always been a scientist at heart. I like to ask questions. I like to ponder things. I like to figure out puzzles. And so all those things kind of intrigue me. And I have a strong commitment to that and to trying to do it rigorously and well. And that's been expressed throughout my career. After graduate school, I spent the first 10-ish years of my career at the New York Obesity Research Center at St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital and Columbia University. And that was an NIH-funded research center, still is. And for a long time, it was the only NIH-funded nutrition obesity research center or obesity research center in the United States. Now there are about a dozen. And it was a great place to be. It was Mecca. And I just had a wonderful time. And I was surrounded by these brilliant scientists to learn from. I was sort of a kid on the block, and we had physicians and physiologists and statisticians and geneticists and behavioral scientists and everything you can imagine. And people would debate in the most positive ways, right? So it wasn't acrimonious debates. They were competitive debates at times, but about issues. And so if a young person like me at the time said something that went off the rails about obesity or nutrition, then you'd get pulled back in by a senior person who would challenge you and who had decades of experience in that. And so you really learn this interdisciplinary approach to nutrition and obesity. I came to value that. Then later, because I'm a skeptic, I don't like to take anybody's word for anything, I kept studying statistics. And even though my original training was in psychology, that's what my PhD was in, basically people started to see me as a statistician. And so eventually, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, which just had a new nutrition obesity research center, asked me to come down, and the chair of biostatistics there said, I want to hire you as a professor of biostatistics. And I said, but I'm not a statistician. And he said, I've seen your CV. Yes, you are. And so I said, well, okay. So I stopped fighting it and went down there as a professor of biostatistics and eventually became director of the Nutrition Obesity Research Center there. It's still there and in place. It's a great place. Had a great time. And then after 15 years of doing that, wanted to try my hand at something new. And so a deanship at Indiana University in their School of Public Health, which was just being transformed, was opening up. And that was a great new challenge for me. And I really am very proud of what Indiana University and the School of Public Health and I did together to transform that school into a nationally ranked school that it still is today and thriving in research. And then I wanted to come back to being closer to the science and being closer to the nutrition science in particular, being focused. And so here I am back at a research institute. It's a USDA institution, but I am an employee and a professor at Baylor College of Medicine. So I get the best of both worlds. My faculty and I get the good stuff of being members of a great school of medicine and a private university and all the benefits that brings. But I also get the benefit of a large, generous federal budget. And we have a beautiful, our own building with gorgeous, it's a gorgeous building and wonderful laboratories. And we have an esteemed group of faculty that I have the privilege of leading who work on many, many aspects of childhood obesity and nutrition in pregnant and lactating women, and the whole study of that from preconception. How do the state of the parents preconception nutritionally affect life in the offspring, all the way through the children themselves, and then finally up through what are the effects of childhood experience on late life health. So we study that whole range and gamut. It's a very exciting place to be. We do mouse, we do human, we have wonderful metabolic facilities, wonderful laboratories for body composition. I'm having a great time.
That's awesome. Very good. I have, my wife and I frequently visit that area where the Baylor College of Medicine is. Every other weekend. We like that area very much so. We like Nassau Bay too, but I've seen that building, and you're correct, very, very nice place. And you know, Houston's a great place to live, warm year round. I don't know if you're like me, but I do not like cold weather. Coming out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the Air Force Research Laboratories, my wife's from Dallas and once told me, I can only take so much more of the snow. We've got to get back to Texas, hence why I returned to Texas. I want to ask you about some of the research projects that you're most excited about currently at the USDA and Baylor College of Medicine, and where that research is actually heading next. What are some of the projects you're currently working on that you're excited about since you've taken the role of the director position at USDA?
Oh, well, there are so many, it's hard to narrow them all down. We have a greenhouse at the top of our building, and some of our scientists working up there are working on putting anthocyanins, certain anthocyanins, in tomatoes, which would make them purple or purpler tomatoes, and then to study the health effects of those anthocyanins. We have another person in our plant biology group who is looking at and has just discovered a pathway heretofore not fully known and understood that allows metabolism of oxalate. And as you may know, kidney stones are common, and the most common type of kidney stone is the calcium oxalate kidney stone. And oxalic acid is something we get in our diet. You get it when you eat many things, including nuts and spinach. And we don't want to tell people, although we do if they're very prone, not to eat nuts and spinach because we think those are generally good things. But how do we keep the oxalate down? And one way may be to build on this genetic pathway. So that's something that just came out. It's very exciting. I have a LinkedIn post up on it. We have other scientists who are working on whether maternal exercise will lead to long-term protection against obesity in their offspring. That's Dr. Marta Fiorotto is working on that. We have a postdoctoral fellow, Monica Kandukari, who's working on what we call drama words. That is, she's using natural language processing, high-performance computing, to study the use of language in scientific papers about childhood nutrition and obesity to see whether there is an excessive use of dramatic language that raises emotion in the reader without accurately conveying information. Those are just a few of the many projects we have going on in humans and animals. We have wonderful mouse work going on, lots of good stuff.
Well, the the kidney stones are an issue that many people have, including myself, over the past probably 12 to 15 years. I've roughly had 13 kidney stones, which were diagnosed as, the primary cause the physician said was due to dehydration. But when, I'm not out running and sweating and I still have kidney stones, probably not linked to that. So that research sounds very interesting to me. Of those projects, what do you think, of those that you mentioned could have the most meaningful impact in the next few years? And why do you think they would have that impact?
I think that there's impact at the scientific level, and then I think there's impact at the applied or clinical level, you might say. Both are hard to predict. At the scientific level, I think that the work I just mentioned on oxalate, I think that some of the work, and that's, by the way, Paul Fukada's laboratory, some of the work being done by Dr. Yi Zhu, ZHU, in our group on the molecular effectors of outcomes with respect to cardiometabolic health being done in mice. He's on the trail of some very interesting genetic influences, and that some of those influences which have transgenerational effects. That's really quite intriguing, and I think there's a lot of power there scientifically, and there are just many others. In terms of practicality, I would say we've got folks like Dr. Alexis Lecky Wood, who is studying the health effects of multiple things, including red meat, and perhaps finding that the health effects of red meat may be better and different than we've traditionally been led to believe in the last couple of decades. And for anyone who likes or wants to eat red meat and be healthy, that's an important and exciting and potentially immediately actionable thing. And then we've got people who are studying some big, important social and clinical things. These include how to increase physical activity in children and families living remotely and in agricultural settings and rural settings. And it includes things involving more short-term physiologic effects of food. We're trying to get some funding to look at, for example, milk fat globule membrane. There's a lot of interest in the positive benefits of dairy and meat and fish consumption these days, both as whole foods, but also for their components. And milk fat globule membrane is something in milk fat that we think is actually very healthy. And we think it has benefits that are detectable. You don't have to wait decades for this, in cognitive factors and in musculoskeletal repair and in strength reparations after injuries, right? So whether it be an adolescent athlete or a soldier who sustains an injury, can we treat them with milk fat globule membrane and get faster recovery from that injury? That's something we want to study. We're looking into similar things with ketone bodies, applying exogenous ketones. So instead of having to go on a ketogenic diet, if there's a condition in which the ketones themselves are responsible for some benefit, can we just administer the ketones exogenously? And the answer, of course, is yes. And then will it have that beneficial effect? And so we're trying to look into those questions as well. And that's, vital for soldiers who get traumatic brain injury. It can be useful in stroke. Again, in principle, these need to be demonstrated better, but useful in stroke, useful in conditions where there's hypoxia, and that could be an adolescent with obesity-induced hypoventilation or sleep apnea, with subacute hypoxia. It could be a subclinical brain injury, like just heading a soccer ball, not enough to cause a concussion, but we know that it does cause damage. Or it could be serious damage, much more serious damage, like a soldier getting traumatic brain injury from an IED. all of those things can be potentially mitigated and prognosis improved through the use of things like exogenous ketone bodies, omega-3 fatty acids, creatine, and a few other things. These are all things under study. And I think these are some of the most exciting and important things we could be looking at.
Yeah, that a lot of what you mentioned would be applicable in the clinical military domain for soldiers, especially those in highly specialized career fields, like special operators on the ground, fighter pilots that continually fly sorties during, battlefield type operations. So there could be some transfer of what you're doing on the clinical pediatric side to absolutely to the military research domains. I have a question on
Exactly.
if you're a researcher in your organization and you come up with a very interesting sort of practical, applicable research idea, and yet it's hasn't been completely explored in your specific research specialty. How does that work? Do scientists, do you have like research calls for scientists every 3 months, every 6 months where they're intramurally funded? I say that because when I was in the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson, roughly speaking, every 3 to 4 months, there would be an intramural call. We had the specific vision and mission of the organization. We had to keep that in mind. It couldn't be something completely out of that vision or mission. And we would have research calls where we would present these innovative ideas to a committee, and then those committee members would vote on whether or not they would actually fund it intramurally. That's sort of how it worked in the Air Force Research Lab because they had so much intramural funding available. How does that work at Baylor College of Medicine and USDA? Are the researchers basically told, hey, here's our mission and vision this year, because it changes roughly every 2 to 3 years, on here are research topics we need covered, so go ahead and choose which ones you're going to cover and study this for roughly 1 to 2 years. Sort of give the audience a broad overview of how it works in your organization.
Sure. It's a mixture of all of those things. Universities that have the word universe in them, they're sort of the places where we have to be all things to all people. We can't focus in the way that some other organizations focus, but we could focus a little bit. And so we look to the USDA for their priorities. Secretary Rollins has just put out in the recent past a very clear statement of the priorities of USDA, and it includes nutrition for the general benefit of populations, nutrition to support agriculture, to develop new products that may help agricultural commerce, increase rigor in science, and a focus on whole foods. So we're very excited about that, particularly the focus on dairy and meat and fish as being quite interesting. We also get from NIH and other organizations a sense of what they think is important. But we always, also are highly influenced by what our faculty and our students and our postdoctoral fellows think are interesting and important. That's where the most novel and exciting ideas may come from. Now, we try to keep them focused. So if somebody says, I've got a great new idea about art history, I say, well, that's nice, but we're not the art history research center.
Yeah.
Can you stay in something related to childhood nutrition? But within that, we want those big, bold, creative ideas. Now, the challenge is sometimes that big, bold, creative ideas require some initial data before anybody is going to believe that they're worth anything and invest big money in them. So we do have some funds within our center, some that we've put in reserve, some that come from USDA every year, that we can use somewhat flexibly. It's not a lot, but somewhat flexibly to help people get started. We're probably in much better shape on that than many academic researchers because we're not totally dependent on all of our faculty funding all of their salaries and all of their expenses with their own individual grants they get. The appropriation to our center funds much of their activity, so that helps a lot and allows some flexibility. Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital are also very good, and particularly Texas Children's Hospital in raising philanthropic funds. And it's our philanthropists who help us, and our center's gotten some philanthropy as well, that give us that incredibly flexible money that is really valuable, where once it's in, you can usually do almost anything with it in a research context. And that allows you to really test, or at least begin exploring sometimes the crazy idea, or the idea no one else knows about, or the idea you're having trouble explaining to people, or you need a feasibility check. And this allows you to move quickly and do that.
Yeah, that's important for a lot of young researchers, scientists out there to know that a lot of the extramural funding requires some preliminary data. If you're not for the initial pre-proposal, but if you're invited back for a full proposal, that it's almost a requirement, not in all cases, but in most cases, that you have this pilot study data to at least show that there's specific trends that are emerging that could equate to a positive outcome relative to your initial hypothesis. So for your organization at Baylor College of Medicine and the USDA, if there's companies out there, other academic institutions, how do collaborations typically work, or partnerships through the USDA, and how do you specifically locate those partners? Or if a group reaches out to you and says, hey, you're doing some interesting research here, we're doing similar research, have you thought about partnering? And I say that because towards the end of my tenure at AFRL, the collaboration with outside companies, smaller companies, could be large too, but a lot of them were small companies that already had, a product that was in maybe a technology readiness level 5, 6. They had some supporting data, but they needed further investigation using real-time soldiers out in either in a laboratory in a field, that we would then come together as a team and decide, is there enough evidence that we could support this for a year? Then the company, of course, would purchase the equipment we needed, et cetera. How does that typically work with the USDA and Baylor College of Medicine collaborations?
There are multiple different ways this can proceed. Very, very loosely speaking, you might say there are situations in which the impetus is coming from us and we're approaching the outside party outside our center. And that could be a company. It could be a commodity group, which is common, like the National Dairy Council or the National Cattlemen's Beef Association or the Pecan Board or the Peanut Board or the American Potato Education Research Institute. And we've had funding from all of those groups. So milk, eggs, beef, bread, avocados. We're equal opportunity. We love them all. And so we'll sometimes approach them and say, we've got an idea. That's, for example, with our milk fat globule membrane study that we're trying to see if the Dairy Council will fund. We had that idea. I approached them. They said, we're interested. Now we're talking. Then there are other times when someone will approach us. Sometimes it's a company who says, I have a product, or I'm thinking of developing a product, and we have some questions about it. We want to know if it promotes more or less satiety, or what happens to people's lipids when they eat it, or how does it affect their skeletal muscle and strength, what have you. Is it good for kids? Is it good for pregnant women? And we can potentially do those studies. Again, it could be animals, it could be humans. they'll approach us, knowing our expertise. Often they'll approach us also for to be in partner with a third party. So they may say, we have another group that is going to look at something, but we want your group to handle the statistical parts because we have a reputation for being strong in that area and very rigorous. We also get funding for things like conferences. So we actually put on a protein conference about a year ago that was a huge hit, and we just had a paper come out in critical reviews in food science and nutrition on that, and being very well received. And now we're doing a follow-up, which is best methodologic practices for studying protein. And again, many of the companies and commodity groups are helping to fund that conference by making donations to Baylor College of Medicine. So those are just a few of the many ways that we can work together.
Or is there such thing as a cooperative research and development agreement? Is that in place at USDA? I note that because working for the military, it was always, all right, well, you want to partner with this specific company or academia, there has to be a legal cooperative research and development agreement in place. And now I never was a fan of that. I understood why, but I wasn't a fan of that because it took, roughly speaking, 3 to 6 months to even get it approved. And it had to go through multiple channels for approval. I thought the process was very inefficient. Not saying that I don't understand why they did it that way, but it sounds like you don't actually have that in place at the USDA. There's not like, okay, step 1 is this, step 2 is this. That's not really how it works. Is that correct?
Well, it depends on the nature of the project. There often is some legal documentation and some contracts. But not always. So, for example, if I want to write a paper with a colleague who's a professor over at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and I'm not sending any money or anything over there, and they're not sending any money or anything over here, we're just writing a paper together. There's usually no formal, legalistic agreement between the institutions. That investigator and I will just come up with, at most, an email that says, this is what we both understand we're doing and how we're going to proceed, and we agree, and that's that. On the other hand, if I'm going to do a study, let's say of a randomized controlled trial, and feed some humans peanuts versus almonds and see what happens. In that case, I'm going to need much more documentation. There will be an institutional review board that I will have to go through and apply for. And assuming I'm getting some funding, let's say it was from the almond board, then there would be a legal contract between the almond board and Baylor College of Medicine specifying how much monies are coming, what they are to be used for, how will monies be returned at the end if we don't use them all those questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to jump in here. This podcast, really, I wanted to cover rigor in science, reproducibility, peer review, and how research becomes public guidance. So I'm going to delve into this question. There's been a lot of discussion in recent years, especially with the COVID and the mask wearing and stand 6 feet apart, about rigor and reproducibility. And these really aren't new to science. I mean, rigor and reproducibility have been issues for a long time, long before COVID hit. What do you see as the biggest underlying causes of problems in the science community with rigor and reproducibility? And then of those concerns, what do you believe are the most damaging?
Yeah. I think the biggest reason that sort of encompasses all other reasons is that science is done by humans, and humans are imperfect. And we have both imperfections that are sort of, you might say, quasi-random. There are mistakes. They're the fact that we miss things, that we sometimes don't think logically, that we sometimes miscalculate, forget something, what have you. And then there are reasons that are more, you might say, systematic and maybe a little biased, and not so benign. And these can be the thing people tend to point out the most, in my experience, is the financial conflict of interest. But I think that that's only one of many, and I know absolutely no evidence to suggest that it's a more influential factor than anything else. In fact, in my subjective experience, it's a less influential factor than things like ego, search for dominance, commitment to certain philosophical perspectives. All of these things can be biasing as well. And they're all quite problematic. And they're more so in fields like nutrition and obesity, because people have everyday experience with that. Nutrition is not just molecules. Nutrition and food is mother's love, it's family, it's culture, it's religion, it's economics. We all eat virtually every day, and we all have experience. It's very meaningful to us. So we come to the table with these kinds of biases that we might not bring if what we were studying was cilia in cells and how they affect cell polarity. You know, most people would not have a lot of a priori positions on that, or philosophical positions or emotional reactions. But when you start to talk about, should we drink milk or not? Should we be vegetarians or not? Is red meat good? Is it good to eat late at night or not? Is it good to eat with your family versus eating alone? People start to have very strong beliefs, and those beliefs often distort the evidence. So I think that's a big problem. We see lots and lots of evidence distortion. The random errors are also problematic. You know, there's the mistakes, but those tend not to be so systematic. But the things that are due to these philosophical predilections of, I think things that are made by companies are bad, or things that are consumed by common masses of people are bad. Anything else you want that's your philosophical predilection, these tend to be much more problematic, I think, because they lead to consistent adoption of unproven ideas, which sometimes, when we finally get around to checking them, we find are not only unproven, but in fact the exact opposite is true. And I can give many examples, both in nutrition science, but also outside nutrition science.
So regarding this rigor and reproducibility, and I know that, you weren't a statistician. I think that's, I have a little story here. When I was, again, it goes back to AFRL and Brooke Army Medical Center. I worked with several engineers, and some of those engineers actually became physiologists. And, people would question, well, why are you in physiology? Your degree is in mechanical engineering. And it was just, they had lots of questions, and they can learn. They learned on their own, and they actually enjoyed the study of animal and human physiology, and got into that, kind of changed their trajectory of where they would end up conducting scientific experiments and working in robust laboratories. So on that, there are some examples where in statistical analysis that they don't actually match the experimental design. And that can result in inaccurate findings, inaccurate conclusions. What are, in your history and with all your experience, what are the most common ways that mismatch actually happens?
There are many ways, but I think one that I see the most often where the analysis doesn't match the design is when there is clustering, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. When there is clustering or nesting in the design, and that occurs, and then it is not taken into account in the statistical analysis. That occurs commonly. Clustering occurs when the units of observation, people, mice, whatever you're studying, exist in some groups. And that grouping is not taken into account. Nesting is a particular form of clustering in which every member of the group is assigned to receive the same treatment in a study of treatment. And that sometimes, if it's done randomly, is called a cluster randomized design. So suppose, for example, a military base called you and me and said, would you please do a study for us of whether adding broccoli to the lunch menus has this benefit? And we say, okay, sure, glad to. And let's suppose that this base is so big that they have 20 different dining halls. And in each dining hall, each person on the base goes to one and only one dining hall. So we say, aha, it's going to be hard to assign individuals to eat or not eat broccoli because there'll be broccoli around, and somebody assigned to not eat broccoli may take some of the broccoli and vice versa. But what we could do is say, why don't we assign an entire dining hall to either be one where broccoli is served or one where broccoli is not served. And then everybody who goes to that dining hall is exposed to that same treatment of broccoli or no broccoli. Well, that's fine. And let's say, we assign 10 dining halls to the broccoli condition and 10 dining halls to the not broccoli condition. We've really only got 10 independent observations in each treatment condition, even though there might be 100 persons who dine at each dining hall. So you might think, well, don't I have 10 for the dining halls per treatment condition times 2 treatment conditions times 100 persons in each dining hall? Doesn't that mean I have 20 times 100 or 2,000 observations? Yes, you have the observations, but they're not independent because people in the same dining hall may be more similar to each other than others. They may have influenced each other. They may continue to influence each other. And that needs to be taken into account. What you really have in terms of randomizable units is 20, not 2,000, because you have the 20 dining halls that you could randomly assign. And you need to make your statistical analysis correspond to that. And often people don't, and they get wildly inaccurate results. This is true in many areas, but in childhood, community type, school-based, community-based obesity intervention programs are probably the worst in having a great deal of using this study design, cluster randomized trial, a great deal, but then also often not analyzing them correctly.
In regards to this rigor and reproducibility, how much of the problem do you think is due to bad intent versus just ordinary human bias or institutional pressure? A lot of the colleagues I work with, I found it was more of the institutional pressure of, well, we don't have, because I work in 2 separate laboratories. One was, we have plenty of money as long as it meets mission, vision, goals. You present it, most of the time we're probably going to award it, et cetera, et cetera. Then I go to an Army lab, it's just the opposite. There's 0 intramural funding. Any funding you get will come from extramural dollars. So, there was a lot of pressure in that case to submit those proposals and get extramural funding, because as you know, it's highly competitive. So in your opinion, do you think it's just some bad intent? Is it just ordinary human bias, or more of, I've got to continue this extramural funding to secure my laboratory?
I think the issue of the funding, as you described it, I've got to maintain my laboratory, I'll put under the broader category of misaligned incentives, or incentives that in addition to having positive effects, also have negative effects. I think then there's the issue of bias for other reasons besides pursuing the incentives, those incentives, and that's ego, pride, philosophical predilection, quest for dominance, so on. And then I think there's a great deal of just error, and we don't like to admit errors. So I think there are multiple different factors going on. If I had to put my finger on it, I would say in terms of the degree of egregiousness of the mistakes made, it's usually the zest for fame, glory, and what that also subsequently brings, like maybe more grant funding and so on. When I see people really do bad stuff, where it's, they just make up the data, the real dishonest stuff, it's often around there. In contrast, if you ask me with frequency, what happens, I think it's the sort of more human biases around not checking things we believe, or once we get something in our head, not wanting to look at the data or honestly review the data that might suggest otherwise, and carrying ideas on over and over. And so that's the confirmed paleo diet person who won't maybe look at the value of eating certain plants or other foods with a fair mind, or won't look at all. And it's maybe the vegan who has a very strong philosophical belief about veganism, who won't look at the evidence involving meat consumption fairly. And again, I think you pick a nutrient and I will find somebody who will hate you for studying it. People are passionate about these things.
Yes.
I had a colleague who, a very senior man, he was head of the Nutrition Institute at Columbia University, Richard Deckelbaum. He since sadly passed on. And one night I was lamenting some of these things, and Richard said to me, David, I've been in 3 different fields. He said, I'm a pediatrician, I've been in pediatrics. He said, I'm a gastroenterologist, and I've been in gastroenterology. And he said, I'm in nutrition. He said, nutrition is different. He says, nutrition is religion. And I think that's the most common problem. It's the person who has just decided that seed oils are bad, or ultra-processed food is bad, or food sold by big companies is bad, or potatoes are bad, or carbohydrates are bad, whatever it is, soybeans are bad. There's someone for everything.
Yes, totally agree. I'm going to move on to the peer review process now, Dr. Allison, and let me tell you, this is very much in my wheelhouse with the peer review process. On the rigor behind it, I disagree with the peer review process, but I want to get your feedback here. What do you view as the biggest problems with the peer review process, and how do those problems affect the quality and credibility of science?
I think the biggest problem with the peer review process is that, given the way it is conducted today, and given what I think would be a reasonable limitation on the financial resources we should put into strengthening it, there is no way in Hades it can accomplish what many people think it does or should accomplish. I think people want it to be a robust gatekeeper, a robust sieve that catches almost all errors and assures things were done well. I think that's absolutely unrealistic. I don't think it ever could do that, and I certainly don't think it can do that now. I look at peer review of scientific papers, at least, much like a restaurant reviewer as opposed to a health inspector. If I read a restaurant review, I expect to be told, well, what kind of food did they have? How did it taste to this person? Did they find the service pleasant? Was the menu broad, etc.? What I don't expect is that the reviewer went back into the kitchen and checked if there were any rodents, swiped all the surfaces to look for microbes, tested samples of the food to see if there were any adulterants in it. That's beyond what we can expect a restaurant reviewer to do. That's why we have health inspectors and other organizations. I think what we need to do is stop pretending that peer review can do more than it does. The system is strained. We get thousands of requests. Those of us in academia get thousands of requests for peer review. They're unpaid. They're time consuming. I just did a peer review for the National Academies of Science for a very important big report. It probably took me about 8 hours, and there's no payment for that, but it's very important. So I did it. I can't do 1,000 of those a year. So I think we need to start working with AI more and getting it to flag things, not to be the final arbiter, but to flag things and say to the reviewers or the editors, check that. That looks a little funny. We need to work with other systems. We need a spot checking system. When we go through the airport, the security inspectors, sometimes a little beep goes off and they say, oh, sir, come over here. No, you didn't do anything wrong. It was just random. We just need to pat you down. Okay, fine. We have engineers check the planes before we take off. Okay. Why do we not have a national spot checking system for the research that, among other people, our soldiers who defend us are defended by? If I'm saying to a soldier, or you're saying to a soldier, or anybody's saying to a soldier, take these ketone bodies every day. If you get a brain injury, these might protect you a little bit. Or afterwards, take these to help you. By gosh, we want to know if the research behind that is sound.
Correct.
How do we not have an inspection system for that? So I think what they need to do is employ folks, this is some of the work we do, and other colleagues sometimes we're called sleuths, colloquially in the literature, to find papers and say, let's check this one out. And I think some of that should be targeted. I think if the military is going to say, for example, we recommend that you take ketones or creatine or omega-3 fatty acids or whatever, because we think there'll be some nutritional benefit, then by gosh, they should be having people like me spot check those publications to make sure they're rock solid. We should be having the NIH and the NSF spot checking or giving contracts to people to spot check the scientific literature overall. Again, I think we should be using AI on this. I think we should really start mandating that scientists put out their raw data and their statistical code publicly at the time of publication. None of this nonsense that we have now with the statement in the paper. Data are available upon reasonable request. We and others have much experience. We write to folks and suddenly we find, I guess our request wasn't reasonable because no one's giving us the data.
Correct.
That needs to stop. And I think, let's just say, for example, the military funds a study. And they say, okay, here, professor, you do this study and then you go publish it. I think as a condition, they should say, if you take our money, unless this is something classified, you have to put those data out publicly and easily accessibly with a data dictionary and a code book at the time of publication. No more upon request. Then anybody can go there. If you get hit by a bus tomorrow, they can still go there and get the data and check it. And I think when we have that data checking, when we have pre-registration reliably, when we have the mandate to publish, so you can't say, well, I didn't get a result I like, I just stick it in my file drawer. Nope. You took the federal government's money, you put human subjects at risk, you potentially cause pain to mice or rats, you have an ethical and legal obligation to put that paper out. Those three things: put the paper out, no choice; put the raw data out, no choice. Again, with exceptions, there'll always be exceptions, but they should be rare. And spot checking, and I think those things would go a long way.
I totally agree that, and I know you've had a few experiences where I know you published a paper that we discussed briefly in Nature about some of these issues. And when I was reading through that, you were discussing, how many times you had to reach out to request this data, and it was basically nothing happened.
Yeah, and this is common. Or we find a very serious mistake, and we can show to any reasonable statistician that the data were misanalyzed and that the results are either invalid or the conclusions unsubstantiated. And we'll go to the editor, and the editor will refuse to act. Or every weird combination. The editor will say, I can't publish your letter until I publish a letter, or unless I publish a letter along with it from the authors allowing them to rebut. But the authors are writing letters that I don't consider acceptable for publication, so I can't publish their letter. And if I don't publish theirs, then I can't publish yours. And this is crazy.
Yep.
Or,
yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Allison, for pointing this out. We're publishing your letter, and you now owe us $4,000 publication fee for the open access to the letter. What?
It's insane. It's insane. What do you think most people outside of academia misunderstand about the peer review process?
I think both outside and within, quite frankly, I think there's a sense that it could and should be this fine mesh sieve. And I think, again, it is just completely unrealistic. Most of us don't have the time. Even if we have the time, we don't have the expertise and we don't have the access to the information. If I review a paper, I may have the statistical expertise to look at it and do a good job with that. But if the paper also involves, for example, a mass spectrometry analysis of proteins, I'm not an expert in mass spectrometry, and the authors might do or say something that makes no sense, but I wouldn't catch it. It's unrealistic to think that you're going to have a peer reviewer who's an expert on everything. It's also unrealistic to say, even if I'm an expert, that I can catch everything. I may say, well, I understand what you're saying you did with statistics, but I'm not looking at your code necessarily, so I don't know that you actually did that. The mass spectrometry person would say, I don't know that you actually prepared the samples and ran the mass spec correctly. You can't do all that.
No. How do you feel that funders and journal editors in nutrition and exercise science should ensure that public health recommendations are based on strong empirical evidence rather than moving too quickly from what the data show to what people think should be recommended? In other words, how can they help prevent weak or premature science from turning into public health advice too quickly?
So that's a really intriguing question, because it presupposes something that perhaps you believe, but is not necessarily, is not a logical necessity, which is that what we recommend to people needs to be based on, and I'm underscoring that word based on science that's convincing that that recommendation will have some value. And I don't think that's true. I think there's a difference between conclusions and recommendations. So if you were to say to me, for example, David, do you conclude that stigmatizing persons with obesity actually leads to even more obesity among them because of certain emotional reactions. I'm not really sure that I do know that unequivocally, but let's suppose that the research supports that to a reasonable degree of certainty. And then you might say, therefore, we shouldn't stigmatize persons with obesity, and we should have some policy about that. Maybe. But does that imply that if I answered by saying, no, I'm sorry, Dr. O'Hara, the evidence that stigmatizing persons with obesity leads to more obesity is actually very weak, or maybe it shows it's not true at all. Does that mean we should stigmatize persons with obesity? I don't think so. I don't want to stigmatize persons with obesity, period. And I don't need any data to support that position. Alternatively, if you could show me that treating some racial or gender or religious group unfairly led to some beneficial outcome, even if the data was strong, I'd say, well, I don't care. I don't want to treat people unfairly. Not okay. So in my view, what we need is things to be evidence-informed, but not evidence-based. And I think that's what we see all the time with things like the dietary guidelines. Again, very controversial, but some people put great value on protecting the environment and said if we eat more of this thing, it's going to be better for the environment than if we eat more of that thing. And other people say, and so they want to recommend it. Other people say, well, that's your value, but my value is agricultural economics, or the financial well-being of the consumer, or the pleasure of eating certain things, or the individual health of the consumer. And that might lead to different answers. In addition, you might say there are offsetting things. So if you look at the current dietary guidelines for Americans, which just came out, there are these statements like avoid added sugars. Avoid, not, well, maybe try to have a little less or take them moderately. Whereas on alcohol, it was more, some moderate amount is okay. And people asked Mehmet Oz, Dr. Oz, about this, and he replied of saying, well, I'm not saying that some amount of alcohol is actually beneficial to, direct physical health, but has some social and psychological value by allowing people to interconnect. And again, whether he's right or wrong, I don't know, but that's his opinion. And given that opinion, he's bringing that social and moral value into the mix to make an evidence-informed decision, right? He's informed about the health harms of alcohol consumption, but he's coupling that with what he perceives as the social benefits to come up with an overall recommendation. So I think that for some things, we don't need any evidence to make a recommendation. We just say, this feels right, feels good. For some things, we don't need any evidence to say, don't do it. But I think what we need to do is separate that from our statements about the evidence. So just because I want people to eat A or not eat A or what have you, doesn't mean I have a license to distort the evidence about how strong the evidence is that eating or not eating A will lead to such and such outcome. I need to be honest and say, this intervention or this food we think may have this effect with this degree of certainty. And then we can say, but we really hope you do it. We need to separate that out. And I think that's where many of our public health advocates, politicians, and many of our colleagues in academia, some intentionally, some unintentionally, they blur that line. They try to come out and say, I'm a scientist, I have special knowledge, I know, and I have shown scientifically that you should eat more of this and you should eat less of that, or you should take this drug and you shouldn't take that drug. That's just nonsense. Science never tells you what you should do. It tells you what might happen if we know. It tells you what might happen if you did it. It doesn't tell you what you should do. That's a social moral judgment.
Totally agree, Dr. Allison. Now, this is our last question. If you could leave researchers, policymakers, and the public with one message about rigor, trust, and impact in science, what would it be?
In science, three things matter: the data, the methods used to collect the data, which give them their probative value, and the logic connecting the resulting data to conclusions. That's science. Those are the three elements of science. Everything else is not science. So whether we like the people or not, whether we think food companies are good or bad, whether we think the military is good or bad, whether we think you should or shouldn't eat like your grandmother, whether who you took money from, all of that is immaterial. What matters is those three things. And when we ask, should we trust science? If what we mean by that is, should we trust some particular study? We need to be ready to drill into those questions. And if we're going to put trust in anything, it may want to be that we trust certain people to say, I'm going to use formal processes to dig into that. The data and the methods and the logic are king. They are what determines the trustworthiness of the science and our ability to say, this is our best take today on truthfulness.
You heard it, audience: data, methods, and logic. That is science for the young researchers out there, and even for the old researchers out there and experienced ones. Dr. Allison, again, I want to thank you for joining us today on the Human Odyssey podcast presented by Sofix Synergistics, LLC in Houston, Texas. We're a human factors engineering firm, as well as applied health and performance research division, consulting company. Audience, I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Dr. Allison today. He's a renowned researcher in nutrition, obesity, exercise science, the director of Baylor College of Medicine, USDA in Houston, Texas. And thank you again, Dr. Allison, for joining us today.
The Human Odyssey is presented by Sofix Synergistics, the experts in human-centered design. Find out more at sofixsynergistics.com. Get smart. Get Sofix smart.